Hello and welcome to this Bitcoin Magazine interview. My name is Vlad and my guest today is Carl Dong, who works for Chaincode Labs and is responsible for one of the latest articles which I wrote, which is about GUIX, which actually is pronounced as Geeks, and it's supposed to increase the security of development on the Bitcoin protocol and helps you download the packages as in compiled code in a way that is much more trustless, and it's a very geeky, to make a bad pun, kind of invention that I didn't even consider or think about. It's supposed to replace GTN or whatever you pronounce, the predecessor of the protocol. And it's a useful tool that only makes Bitcoin more decentralized. So, hello, Carl.
Hi, nice to be here.
I'm happy that we get to do this, and I'm happy that I get to have the insights of the person who actually developed the protocol, which made Bitcoin development more trustless and more secure.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call it a protocol. It's more of a tool, but yeah, I would say it can be a little bit confusing to outsiders. So no, I fully appreciate the chance to explain what I'm doing and what this is about.
So I watched a conference in which you talked about being partly disillusioned with the idea of developing on Bitcoin just because you had to trust the previous developer and be sure that the code that they compiled was safe. And how did you come up with the idea, or did you borrow any elements from other open source projects?
Oh, well, so actually, I sort of got on this whole thing because of Gitian, right? I think there weren't many reproducible builds sort of systems like Gitian before Gitian was invented. But basically, as Gitian came out and the years surrounding that, there's a whole reproducible builds movement, right? And I sort of looked into that, and I was looking into how Gitian was achieving its reproducible builds, and I realized that there were like a lot of flaws around that, and I don't know, I'm a somewhat paranoid person. So and from a very young age, I like playing with Linux distros and compiling things from source, and so when I saw that Gitian was doing, when I saw the promise of Gitian, as in what it was advertised for, I was super excited because reproducible builds solve a lot of problems. But when I actually looked at the code and looked at what it was actually doing, that's when I was quote unquote disillusioned. And so I talked about it with a few people on the Bitcoin Core IRC, and they also said, yeah, this is sort of like a stopgap kind of solution, and we have other things in the works. And that's where I got introduced to Corey Fields, who have been doing like work in this regard as well. And that one thing led to another, and then I learned about this cool project called Geeks from one of my Chaincode colleagues, Russ Yanofsky. And then things took off from there. Actually, I hacked up like a prototype in one weekend just because like I saw Geeks and I was like way too excited about it. And that weekend I didn't really sleep that much. It was just caffeine and coding and talking on IRC with people. And thankfully, all the Geeks developers on IRC are like super friendly, super helpful. So we were able to get something going there.
I guess we're happy that we have this type of development in Bitcoin.
Oh
And
yeah.
it's only encouraging to see that exchanges become much more interested in investing some money which they earn back into the development of the protocol.
Yeah. I believe so. There's there are a lot of things to do in Bitcoin Core, and I think one of the reasons why I was so interested, why I thought this would be and still think that this is a valuable contribution, is because we've not had there are not many pieces of open source software that are so security critical as Bitcoin Core, right? Because if if someone were to be able to inject vulnerabilities into Bitcoin Core through through the Gitian method of building Ubuntu, right? That would infect all of the nodes, and like maybe we would say that an invalid transaction is valid, and then the whole network, it has to restart basically, right? It's quite a big thing. So yeah.
So let's just take a minute and try to speak as if the people listening have no idea about Gitian and have no idea about Geeks and have no comprehension on why this is important and why it matters. Can we say that it's all about transposing human language, which can be a programming language, into computer language, which is binary, and then making sure that the binaries which developers compile are equivalent?
Yes, right. That's exactly it, right? So ever maybe I'll give a little history of how these things came about, right? Like at the very beginning of computers, we basically wrote computer code, ones and zeros, and then did switches and punch cards and whatever, and fed it to the computer, so the computer read them and knew what to do for each set of ones and zeros and whatever, right? As we evolved, things called assemblers and compilers came along, and what those are basically, you express what you want the program to do in this programming language, right? Which is a step closer from ones and zeros to human language. So you basically have the base level, which is the computer language, and then the top level, which is English, or whatever human language you have, and you have this programming language. But this programming language, at the end of the day, has to be what we call compiled down to machine language, right? And so the whole point of Gitian and Geeks and all of the things that I've been doing is making sure that whatever we express, as whatever we explicitly express in our programming language, is what we get at the end of the day. Because at the end of the day, you get this, on your Mac, you get this little app thing that's like a few gigabytes. Like sometimes there are a few gigabytes, and you're not going to look through a few gigabytes of things, right? But if there's a way to make sure that the programming language corresponds to what we get at the end of the day as the output, as the app, then we can look at what the programming is, which is the Bitcoin source code, and that is way more auditable. And so this is why there's been a tradition of paranoid developers saying, hey, you should compile things from source, right? You should always take the source code, take your compiler, and then compile it into whatever, and not just trust that, hey, the Bitcoin Core developers produced this, and obviously that's going to be fine, right? Because that's definitely not fine. We have seen many actually during I think 2014, 2015, that whole altcoin craze. There were, I remember I liked playing this game called Watch Dogs, and apparently if you downloaded a pirated version of Watch Dogs, I think it's called Watch Dogs, I forgot. If you download a pirated version of Watch Dogs, it would run the game, but also in the background, it would run a I think either Litecoin or Monero mining in the background, and send it to the author of this pirated version of Watch Dogs. So that just goes to show that you can't just trust anything that you download from the internet, and for security critical things, you want to compile from source.
Okay, it makes a lot of sense, and you cannot be too careful with Bitcoin, as
Right.
there are lots of bad actors who can get in the way of development.
Yes, right. And I think because there's so much to be sort of directly gained from this, right? And there are market forces that you can play with, maybe like shorting the market as you infiltrate Bitcoin and all of that.
Okay, so prior to working on Geeks and all this stuff, what did you do? I saw that you worked on Bitcoin Rust, which is a repository on GitHub, which seems to be
Ah,
very
yes.
popular. You
Yeah.
also worked for the 21 project, 21.com, and also Blockstream.
Right. Yeah. So I got started on this Bitcoin thing because in high school I was in a science research program, and one of my teachers was like, "Hey, there's this Bitcoin thing that I saw on Slashdot. It seems it seems cool." And back then, I had free electricity from my dorm room, so I mined some Dogecoins and converted it into Bitcoin and all that. And that was about the extent that I did all of this. I think major exposure came when in college, I think my sophomore year, I went to work for 21. And at that time, 21, the main work that I did was this piece of software called 21 Cell. And what 21 Cell did was basically um, it's sort of Ethereum without the smart contract, or is yeah. Anyways, it was basically so for HTTP API calls, there's actually return codes, right? So 200 means okay, and 400 means not okay, and five, anything that's not 200 is not okay, right? But there's a specific return code for payment required. And that's really cool, actually, because that's baked into, that's sort of like standardized in the HTTP protocol. So we basically implemented that so that if you make an API, so if you make an API call to someone who's running 21 Cell, it could say payment required, right? So you can basically sell information and sell API endpoints to people, right? So that was mostly what I worked on, and then and obviously these payments were made using Bitcoin, using like a proprietary payment channel thing that we had at 21. And so after that, I worked a bit at Blockstream. So I helped them with some of the liquid engineering, and that is also where I met Andrew Polstra, and I started working on Rust Bitcoin. And yeah, I still reserve my Fridays to Rust projects, so I can look at the repo and help maintain it and help work on that. I think Rust Bitcoin is quite interesting because I like Rust as a language because it programmatically enforces memory safety. Um, and the good thing about re-implementing some of the stuff that's been implemented in Bitcoin Core and Rust has been that we've been, able to find things and think about things that probably people missed while implementing it in Bitcoin Core. And also, I believe that if people are familiar with the work that Rustianovsky is doing, one of my colleagues at Chaincode, he's writing interfaces between parts of Bitcoin Core so that they can be separated out into their own processes. And perhaps one day we can replace one of these processes with a Rust version of these processes, of this process, so that it's cleaner code and more memory safe and all of that. So I think that's pretty exciting.
It's very interesting that you basically made the connection with the next question, which I had for you about
Okay.
the interesting stuff going on at Chaincode Labs,
Mhm.
because there's quite a lot of exciting projects that you work on, like Fiber, like Better Hash, and all that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, Fiber and Better Hash are, Matt's little babies, and they're definitely quite exciting. Yeah, Matt is a workhorse. I mean, like if you just look at the stuff that he's done sort of this year, like there's a BIP he was pushing out, the Great Consensus Cleanup, which required a lot of like deep reading into the Bitcoin protocol about why each cleanup item is necessary, but at the end it is probably all necessary just for the health of the network and denial of service reasons. I mean, Russianovsky has been working on this multi-process Bitcoin thing, which I think is fantastic. It sort of forces us to separate disparate parts of Bitcoin core that have been a tangled mess up until now, and that's been really nice. And I mean, of course, Marco is doing his maintainership all day, and Suha's doing network, and John is. I mean, I work quite closely with John on Bitcoin Optech, and so that's just that's something that like before I joined Chaincode, like I always thought that the industry needed was something to connect to connect industry folks with what's going on in the development field, right? What how can you use the new features that we think are great? Why is it great for your business, and why you should use it to get a leg up, or at least be at the same level playing field as everybody else. Yeah. And anyways, there's tons of cool stuff going on at Chaincode, and when we have these weekly stand-ups, I'm always amazed by how much people are able to accomplish in the depth of work that everybody's doing.
Something which gets me excited about Bitcoin is the amount of great ideas and development happening at the same time. And you even have a school of thought which says, no, we don't need any kind of major developments on Bitcoin because Satoshi was so brilliant and he's the only developer who really mattered. But at the same time, we have all these improvements which are basically trying to make the most of what Bitcoin is and try to improve it without hard forking the chain. And that's impressive. That's the kind of feat of engineering which deserves all the praise.
Yeah, thank you. I think personally, I think Satoshi laid out a very good groundwork, but I don't think any human, or maybe it was a group of humans, I don't think any of them could have expected. I mean, he's like they're not fortune tellers, right? They couldn't have expected how the industry has been evolving, what kind of actual attacks happen on the network and whatever. So constant development is always needed, and of course, I'm not fully against hard forks, but if we can avoid hard forks, we should do things that way.
Right. I'm really happy that this is happening. And this actually gives Bitcoin the advantage as opposed to all the altcoins which come out during bull markets and say we have improved upon these parameters and we have made this better. Just this robustness and this, I don't know how I should call it, like a careful approach to development, which only proves that it's good engineering and it works.
For sure. And I think one of the things that I think gets talked about a little in the office is compared to a lot of other protocols, I think Bitcoin is actually quite simple, and the amount of minutia, like little things that we have to consider of the interaction between different parts of the code base that we already have to consider with quite a simple protocol is sort of already beyond any one person, right? We have to have multiple people like have these discussions around, how do we change the protocol in a safe way, right? And so, I would hope that new protocols in the future can be simpler rather than more complex, because as humans, we're just not suited to deal with too complex things, and that leads to security holes.
Okay, so when we discussed about a
Mhm.
week ago prior to publishing the article on Bitcoin Magazine. You told me that for now, Geeks is only available for Ubuntu, and that hopefully by the end of the year, you will also release versions for Windows and for Mac. Is that what you currently work on?
So there's there's a very subtle difference there. So right now, Geeks or the Geeks build process can run on any Linux, any new enough Linux. So Ubuntu, Debian, Arch Linux, Gentoo, what have you, right? They can run on any Linux. And what binaries it produces, what Bitcoin Core it produces, we can only produce Bitcoin Core binaries for Linux right now. So what I'm working on for the next few months, alongside some other things, is being able to also produce binaries and executables for Mac and Windows. And when we have that range, and if you go look at the Bitcoin Core website, we support Linux, Mac, and Windows, and different architectures of Linux. And once we have that whole suite, then we can use it for actual releases, right? So maybe like 0.20 will be released through developers building through this Geeks process. But Gitian, Gitian only ever ran on Linux, and fairly poorly on distributions that weren't Ubuntu or Fedora. Geeks being able to run on any Linux with a new enough kernel is a step forward, I believe.
Right. So, what is it that gets you most excited about your work right now in Bitcoin development?
What gets me? um, hmm, that this is just a bit of maybe personal philosophy. I think good money is money that lasts, and I think by working on maybe this Geeks thing isn't the sexiest work in Bitcoin, but I believe that these are real attack vectors that we should think about, and we can lead the software industry and thinking and mitigating against these attacks. And by doing so, we are able to make sure that Bitcoin is the money that lasts. That's what gets me excited, is because I think software is a great way to change the world, and this is a real life realization of that.
But there's a lot of work that you and Andrew Polstra and all the other developers put into projects like Rust. And how much of what you work on ends up being merged into Bitcoin Core, and how much of it becomes experimental for other projects?
Um, for my contributions, I would say quite a lot of them gets merged into Bitcoin Core, mostly because I think I tried to have discussions either on IRC or on issue tickets to make sure that this is sort of an actual issue, right, and an actual fix, not actually just busy work, right? Because there's a lot of busy work that can be done on a repo, right? But like every once in a while, we'll always have people who come in and like, oh, I formatted the entire code base with this custom formatter, and that's like maybe that kind of change is like super hard to review, because like almost every line has now been changed, and perhaps isn't useful in a practical sense and in a user facing sense, right? So I would say that most of it gets merged in. I would say that for Rust Bitcoin right now, we definitely have less users than Bitcoin Core, because mostly because it's just a library right now. But as we expand on functionality, and as we expand on the other projects that are under the Rust Bitcoin organization, I think it will be much more useful. And I also think that like Rust ecosystem has been growing tremendously, and so future implementations of Bitcoin wallets and all these other things, might want to use Rust Bitcoin, Rust Lightning, our whole suite of things.
Just the other day, I was browsing Twitter like I usually do, and I saw a post by somebody who speculated that in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a big company like IBM, Microsoft, or Oracle or Cisco that will basically just buy their own seat at the table by acquiring a big company which develops Bitcoin projects. And some people have speculated that this might be Blockstream, but Chaincode Labs was also on the list. You think that the small team of Chaincode works for the purpose of building great stuff, or does it also have on the agenda to be acquired by some kind of big corporation to fund whatever projects that you might be having?
Well,
You're not
I
supposed to speak as a representative of
no,
Chaincode Labs.
I'm definitely not suited to speak as a representative, but I think Chaincode works because it is the small size that it is, and there's not a lot, like there's basically total freedom to do the things that you think are impactful, um, in the Bitcoin field, right? And I don't think that could happen in a massive organization. Like, like it would be like, like if Sun was bought by Oracle and everybody left, so something like that.
Yeah, is it hard to get funding for Bitcoin projects?
I think I don't think that is the hardest thing. Actually, I believe that is actually quite easy to do now. I think that there are, now we've got sort of we've got blockchain, we've got Chaincode, we've got MIT DCI, we've got Square Crypto that's coming up. Um, they will fund you to do your Bitcoin project, but also we have individuals who are willing to fund maybe some Bitcoin whales, or exchanges who are definitely willing to fund core core development, right? I don't think that's the hard part. I think the hard part of core development is sort of staying in the community and staying on IRC, and talking with enough people to know the sort of the ethos of the project, the philosophy of the project, and what kind of changes are needed, what kind of changes are not needed. That is the hard part. But once you've got that down, it's pretty okay to find funding. One of the other things that I hope that would happen more often is, I don't know if you know Hardcore Fund. So Hardcore Fund is this Bitcoin fund that funds Bitcoin core developers, and it was started. It's managed by Kevin Pan and Dovey, and they've gotten like so many Bitcoins just from exchanges, and exchanges are happy to donate them because obviously they want to see the protocol be more resilient and all that.
So
Sorry,
when you were
exchanges and
in,
pools.
I didn't get that. Can you say it again?
They're funded by exchanges and like mining pools.
Right. So right now it's a lot easier than it used to be to get funding, as this was a big discussion maybe a couple of years ago, with a lot of developers moving onto Ethereum because people were pouring more money into that kind of development. But now it's settling and it's moving back into Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think so. And it's sort of a bigger problem in general, right? Like how does open source software get developed? I mean, all kinds of open source software have this kind of problems, and I think the model that has been sort of working is, companies that use these open source softwares have an incentive to fund developers of these open source softwares, if only just to there's a bug that we're encountering in production, let's get someone to fix this, right? And so and that's the model that's been working so far, but perhaps there'll be other models in the future, who knows.
When you were in university and you're studying to become a developer, was this your dream job, or were you even considering the idea that you might be working on Bitcoin projects after graduation?
Ah, um, actually, my first year, I I really like user experience research. So like for the first year of university, actually, while I was in college, I actually worked as a UI UX designer. If you can imagine that. Um, but I think what was interesting was that like Bitcoin kept drawing me back. I think is like I had exposure to it in high school, and then I did my design thing, but then my sophomore year I was drawn back, and then I did something else my junior year, and then I was drawn back again my senior year. It just keeps drawing me back because it's sort of at the intersection of politics and technology basically and economics, right? And these I'm just really interested by subjects which are quite interdisciplinary. Now, am I an economist? I'm not an economist. I just think it's quite interesting that it is at these intersections. So yeah, when I was in college, I think at least the last year I was pretty sure that I wanted to go to a company that did something Bitcoin related, because it's interesting. It's sort of, I always thought that the exciting things were behind us, like the internet, like that happened, right? Like operating systems that already happened, right? But to have something come along like Bitcoin, where even if it doesn't work out, it's such a huge learning experience. That was like I have to do this because there's nothing more interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So, how would you advise people who look up to you right now and they want to get into Bitcoin development, but they have no idea where to start?
Huh. I would say look. Actually, you know what? That might not be okay. One of the things that I did, and this is going to be so specific, but maybe specific is good, is we have we have issues and tickets on the Bitcoin repo that are labeled good first issue. And there are services like Zapier or If This Then That that will send you an email every time there's an issue that's labeled good first issue. So, so what I did for myself was basically I set that up. I set up like my If This Then That to give me an email every time there's a good first issue. And at first I would just like look at it, but like if I had something that I really knew about, I would go in and maybe contribute, maybe comment, and maybe talk to people about it, right? Um, that's one way to get started with development. Another way is just to look at what's going on in IRC, but sometimes that's a little too complicated. I think probably the best way right now is John's PR review club. They meet every week. They chat on IRC and they look at new pull requests and the logic behind them. And sorry, it's sort of a nice welcoming space where you can talk about the PR of the week and learn from John and everybody who's participating that week.
Would you say that Chaincode Labs is like a team of prodigy people? Because you and Matt Corallo have started very early on. And then you have people like Eric Lombroso who worked in open source projects for about a decade before getting into Bitcoin.
Um, well, I don't think Eric is at Chaincode, but
No, he's not, but he was
right.
just the counterexample.
Oh, right. Yeah. I wouldn't. Well, also now we've got Gleb. If any of these the listeners know, Gleb has been working with Peter and Greg on Erlay, new transaction relay thing that is just oof, this is sometimes it's beyond me. Um, I don't think that we're prodigies at all. I think we were interested. I think what drives us is sort of the interest, right? and also the time that you spend on a thing. I think anybody who's interested enough can come in and work on this project, and if you work on it long enough, you're gonna like sound like you're a prodigy, but you're really not. You just like spent a bunch of time looking at stuff in the code base. So yeah, that's how I'd characterize it.
Yeah, I see you're also hiring on your website, and the
Yeah.
list of required skills and experience is quite extensive. It also asks for a university degree.
Yeah, I didn't write that, so I don't know. I think that it's really it's really about interest, right? Like, and some of the things that maybe are on the hiring list, I'm not that fantastic at. For example, I am not as good at C++ as like Russ Yanofsky, who like wrote part of the GCC compiler for C++. Like, whoa. Um, but it really is about the interest in, and perhaps one of these, like for example, for me, my interest was in operating systems like Linux and Unix, right? And this is just sort of my fascination. Like one of the things that I did to procrastinate for my exams in college was just like, let me install this weird program operating system, and that's how I procrastinated. So I think given enough passion for the things that you do, you're gonna sound like a crazy person, sound like a prodigy, but it really isn't like any sort of gift. It's just you're obsessed with this thing. Yeah.
Okay, so it's all about passion and finding joy in whatever it is that you want to do. And it's impressive at the same time that when you come into the Bitcoin space, you bring some kind of experience, which
Yeah.
you didn't even know that the space needs, but you can bring your input and help make the whole community or protocol a lot better than it was before your arrival.
For sure, and I think going back to the point of sort of understanding what should be in the code base and what shouldn't be in the code base. um, I think people should bring in new ideas, but I feel like people should first understand why the existing thing is what it is, right? Because there might be very good practical reasons that the existing thing is what it is, and understand that, and understand what their new idea is, and making sure that that new idea doesn't conflict with the existing things which are practical and which works.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I guess we have a long history of developers who came in and proposed improvements, from Gavin Andresen to Mike Hearn to everybody else like Jeff Garzik, and I guess I can name a few more. But it's important to understand the value proposition of Bitcoin and why it has survived for such a long time, why people get drawn to it,
Mhm.
and why it's so robust.
Yeah, that's true. And I would say one of the other things is I think people propose ideas without the code, and I think that's one of the things that has the most drawback, is because as Satoshi said, like I had to prove it to myself that this was all possible by writing the code, right? And sort of that's what what I like to do with sort of weird ideas that I have is I see if there's like a very strong argument against it, and if there's not a very strong argument against it, I'll implement it first, because implementation will tell you much more about the idea than just people like talking on IRC. I mean, the best programmers, sorry, the best maintainers in the Bitcoin Core repository cannot predict the minute details of implementation that you'll encounter along the way, and maybe a detail of implementation that would make other things a lot better, right? So I would say to people who want to implement new ideas, introduce new ideas, is um, of course, ask the community, see if there are very valid objections. But if you don't find any that are convincing enough to you, try a small implementation first, and that will get you very far.
Exactly. And aside from the financial incentive, there are plenty of reasons for developers to get into Bitcoin. As you're an engineer and you know how to do software, you can either go and work for a big corporation and have this kind of meaningless tasks that you have to accomplish, but don't grant you any kind of creativity, or you can pursue something which can actually bring you a lot of satisfaction on a personal level and prove to yourself and to the rest of the world that you can build something great, something that works.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I guess Bitcoin is a great testing ground and proving ground for the prowess of developers.
Yep, totally.
Okay, I'm not sure if I have any more questions, and it has been a pleasure to speak to you.
Yep. Yeah, it's been a great pleasure to speak to you as well.
Actually, I spoke with you, not to you.
Right, right. Yeah.
So if there's anybody else at Chaincode Labs that wants to do an interview, I would be glad to interview him. And also, whenever you have any kind of announcement to make or something new that you work on and you're so excited that you want to get the word out, we can do another interview.
Fantastic. I would love to come back.
So thank you very much, Carl. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you too. All right. See ya.
Bye.